I'm 72 years old now. Saying it out loud still sounds weird, as if the number doesn't suit me inside. For a long time, I thought that age would bring me answers. But what it brought was courage. Courage to look back without softening it too much. Courage to admit that most of my life has been spent trying to understand what hurt me. I spent decades believing what I was told, that I was too sensitive, that I needed to reveal, that certain things were part of life. I repeated these phrases so many times that they became true inside me. And when something hurt, I didn't ask why. I asked, what did I do to deserve this? There was always a ready explanation. If someone was cold, I said it was their way. If they ignored me, I thought they were tired. If they hurt me with words, I said it wasn't bad. I became an expert in justifying attitudes that hurt me, as if it made me mature, understanding, strong. What I didn't realize was the price. Each justification was a piece of me that I left behind. Each time I kept silent, something inside me learned that my feelings were inconvenient. I didn't fight, I didn't confront, I didn't demand. I explained. And explaining, I annulled myself a little more. Today I understand that it was not love that they asked of me. It was pain tolerance. It was silence. It was constant adaptation. I called it care, patience, commitment. But deep down, it was just fear of losing, fear of being alone, fear of being seen as difficult. I remember how many times I went to sleep with a knot in my chest, trying to organize arguments in my head that I didn't need to have created. I rehearsed conversations that would never happen. The next day, I woke up determined to forget, to move on, not to make a drama. And so the years passed, one on top of the other. The most curious thing is that no one has ever asked me directly to justify anything. I did it myself. I learned early on that keeping the peace was my responsibility, that sustaining relationships was my task, and that if something was wrong, the problem was probably me. It took me a long time to realize that living by explaining the behavior of others took me away from myself. The more I tried to understand everything, the less I listened to myself. My desires became small. My pains were mute. And I started to think it's normal to live like that. At 72 years old, I look back with a mixture of sadness and compassion for who I was. I don't blame myself anymore. I was trying to survive the way I knew how. But today I know that surviving is not the same as living, and that spending one's life justifying oneself is a silent form of abandonment. This story does not begin with anger, nor with accusations. It begins with this simple and hard realization. I spent my whole life explaining attitudes that hurt me, and only now do I understand that no explanation should cost me so much. This is the hardest part to tell. Talking about it means giving up the silence that protected me for years and accepting the weight of being seen without explanations. If you have come this far with me, it is because you understand that some truths are too expensive to remain hidden. Sign up, not as a support for me, but as a gesture to preserve this voice and so many others that only exist because someone decides to listen. I was born in a small town where almost everyone knew each other by name and family history. The houses were simple, the streets quiet, and life followed a predictable rhythm. It wasn't a hard place, but it wasn't welcoming with feelings either. There, no one asked how you felt, only how you were behaving. I grew up in a family that valued order and dialogue very little. There were no constant screams or big explosions, but there was something quieter and more persistent. The control by the gaze, the correction by the tone of voice, the disapproval that came without explanation. I learned early on to observe the mood of adults before saying anything. My mother was a tired woman, always busy, always solving everything by herself. My father was distant, more present physically than emotionally. Between them, there was no conversation about feelings, only decisions made and followed. I quickly understood that it was not safe to question, just to accept. When I was sad or confused, I heard that it was silly. When something bothered me, they said I needed to be stronger. Crying was not forbidden, but it was not welcome either. So I learned to swallow my tears, to smile at the right time, to agree even without understanding. I don't remember anyone saying clearly that I needed to be silent. This was never talked about. It was taught in gestures, in pauses, in the subjects that changed when I tried to talk too much. Silence became a familiar place, almost comfortable, because I didn't cause any problems there. At school, I was the well-behaved student, the one who didn't give me any trouble. At home, the daughter who helped, who understood, who didn't demand. She received praise for being too mature for her age, not realizing that that maturity was, in fact, renunciation. I was learning to disappear little by little. Every time I felt something strong and couldn't find space to express it, I kept it. He didn't know how to name emotions. He just knew that they needed to be organized inside, away from others. I began to think that feeling too much was a defect that needed to be corrected. It was in this environment that I learned to justify before I even felt angry. If something hurt, I explained to myself that it wasn't that serious. If someone hurt me, I thought there must be a reason. Silence always came before revolt, and understanding came before care for me. Today, looking back, I see that it was not a tragic childhood, but it was a childhood that trained me to adapt too much. I learned not to take up emotional space. And this lesson, repeated for years, became the basis of everything I experienced afterwards. There, in that simple and silent house, I did not lose my voice at once. I left little pieces of her along the way, believing that this was how she grew up. And without realizing it, I became an adult without ever having learned to listen to myself. Over time, I realized that being silent wasn't enough. I also needed to learn not to feel too much. Feeling had consequences. Looks, subtle reproaches, comments that made me retreat. So I molded my emotions until they fit into a space acceptable to others. What overflowed, I hid. When something hurt me, my first reaction was never indignation. It was an explanation. I tried to understand the other's motive before I even recognized my pain. I thought that maybe I was exaggerating, that maybe I had misinterpreted, that maybe I was being unfair. This constant doubt became my company. I learned to smooth everything inside. If someone was harsh, I would say they were tired. If they ignored me, I thought they didn't understand. If they crossed my limits, I concluded that they did not mean harm. There was always a justification ready, and there was almost never room for what I felt. This behavior began to be seen as a virtue. They said I was understanding, mature, easy to get along with. I received these compliments as confirmation that I was on the right track. I didn't realize that, in order to be like that, I needed to erase myself a little every day. There were times when something inside me screamed, but I didn't know how to translate it into words. It was a diffuse discomfort, a feeling of always being lacking, always owing something emotionally. Even so, I kept going, believing that this was how adults worked. I began to confuse control with care and coolness with stability. He thought that relationships without explicit affection were normal, that love manifested itself in the absence of conflicts. Any emotional need of mine seemed excessive in the face of this, so I reduced, adjusted, silenced. Over the years, my body began to react to what my mouth didn't say. Inexplicable fatigue appeared, constant sadness, a feeling of heaviness in the chest, but I also justified that. He said it was age, routine, responsibility. I never thought it could be accumulated pain. The cruelest thing about this process is that it happens slowly. There is no clear moment of rupture. There are only small concessions repeated until they become identity. I no longer knew where the understanding ended and where the annulment began. When I tried to imagine a version of me that said, "It hurts me," I felt guilty. A deep, almost automatic guilt, as if expressing feelings were selfishness, as if taking care of myself was abandoning others. That thought kept me stuck. Today I understand that I didn't learn not to feel. I learned to doubt what I felt. And when you spend your life doubting your own pain, anything can be normalized, including what, deep down, breaks you little by little. That's how I followed for many years, believing that this was the right way to live, feeling less, talking less, expecting more, not knowing that by doing so, I was training myself to accept almost anything, except myself. The first time I really explained myself didn't seem important at the time. There were no screams, no tears streaming down her face, no slammed doors. It was something small, almost imperceptible, but decisive. I felt a clear discomfort, a clear pain, and instead of naming her, I tried to justify her so that everything would continue. And I was young, still trying to understand how the world worked and what my place in it was. When that attitude hit me, I felt like saying that it had hurt, that it wasn't fair, that I expected something different. But before the courage came, fear spoke louder. Fear of disappointing, of seeming ungrateful, of creating a problem where everyone pretended not to exist. I remember how I mentally organized the arguments to defend the other, not myself. I thought about the context, the person's past, the difficulties they faced. Every detail served to invalidate what I felt. In the end, the conclusion was always the same. I needed to be understanding. I needed to understand. When I spoke, my words came too careful. I didn't accuse, I didn't complain. I explained that maybe I had misunderstood, that maybe it wasn't the intention. I gave all possible ways out so that the other didn't have to assume anything. And in that instant, I saw relief on the other side. The problem had been resolved without conflict. What I didn't realize was what happened inside me. Something has settled in the wrong place. A strange feeling that I had done the right thing, but at the same time I had lost something I couldn't name. It was as if I had betrayed a silent part of me to preserve a fragile harmony. From that day on, justifying became a resource. Whenever discomfort arose, I resorted to that same logic. It was easier to explain than to confront, safer to understand than to expose. I convinced myself that this was maturity, when in fact it was fear disguised as wisdom. Over time, I got very good at it. He anticipated apologies before anyone even needed to ask for them. I myself contained the subject within myself. This avoided arguments, but it also avoided real proximity. After all, no one approaches someone who never reveals what they feel. The most painful thing is that no one asked me to act like that. There was no direct imposition. I chose, over and over again, the path that hurt the least at the time, not realizing the long-term impact. Each explanation I created was a limit that I failed to set. That first time shaped many others. She taught me that my emotions were negotiable. That could be put on the back burner if it kept everything running. And I accepted this silent agreement, believing that I was protecting the relationship. Today, I see clearly. At that moment, I learned to explain myself before respecting myself. And this lesson, repeated over the years, built the foundation of everything that came after. It wasn't a big trauma, but it was the beginning of a pattern that accompanied me throughout my life. At some point, justifying ceased to be a conscious choice and became a reflex. I didn't think before explaining. He simply did it. It was automatic, like breathing. Whenever something bothered me, my first impulse was to find a plausible reason why it wasn't so serious. And the more I did it, the more normal everything seemed. I began to confuse resistance with strength. She thought that enduring was a sign of maturity, that enduring in silence showed emotional balance. I looked at other people who complained, who confronted, and thought that I was different, better prepared for life. He didn't realize that this preparation was, in fact, too heavy armor to carry every day. There were situations in which the discomfort was so evident that my body reacted before the mind. A tightness in the chest, a lump in the throat, a tiredness that came out of nowhere. Still, I kept going. I told myself that it would pass, that it wasn't worth thinking too much, that life was just like that. And he repeated this until he believed it. Over time, normalizing became a form of survival. It was the way I found to continue belonging, not to break ties, not to be alone. I believed that if I started questioning everything that hurt, I would end up with no one. So I chose the known pain instead of the unknown emptiness. This silent choice accompanied me everywhere. At work, I accepted overloads without complaint. In friendships, I overlooked constant absences. At home, I adapted to the emotional climate of others, adjusting my mood according to the environment. My reference was never what I felt, but what was expected of me. I became an expert at reading the other. I noticed changes in tone, prolonged silences, small signs of irritation. I did this to avoid conflict, but also to shape myself before anyone had to ask. It was as if I was always one step ahead, preventing pain that, deep down, was already there. The problem is that, by normalizing everything, I lost the ability to recognize limits. I no longer knew what was acceptable or not. If something hurt me, I automatically thought the problem was in my sensitivity. I doubted myself before I doubted the other. And this constant doubt undermined my confidence. There were times when I thought that maybe I was really too difficult, that perhaps he expected a lot from people, that maybe I was wrong to feel so much. These questions were not accompanied by answers, only more internal silence. And silence, once again, seemed the safest option. Over the years, I realized that normalizing pain had a curious effect. It didn't go away. It just accumulated. It was stored in layers, each one on top of the other, becoming heavier over time. I continued to live, fulfilling roles, keeping up appearances, but something inside me was always tired. Even so, I insisted on believing that this was how people lived, that everyone did the same, that no one was really satisfied. This belief helped me to continue without question. After all, if everyone was surviving like that, why couldn't I? Today I understand that that normalization was not true acceptance. It was forced adaptation. I was shrinking to fit into spaces that were never meant for me. And while I was doing that, I left important parts of myself along the way, believing that it was the price to pay to continue being loved. It was during this period of my life that I failed to notice when something crossed my limits. Because for me, almost everything already seemed too limiting. And when everything is too much, nothing is questioned. I just kept going, taking a deep breath, convinced that surviving was as long as I could hope for. When I look back, I realize how my life has always seemed right to the eyes of outsiders. I followed the expected steps, made choices considered sensible, fulfilled roles without major deviations. Nothing drew attention, nothing caused concern. Still, there was a discreet, constant emptiness, which I never knew how to explain properly, only feel. I got married believing that stability was synonymous with emotional security. There was no overwhelming passion, but there was approval, expectation, and the feeling of doing what was right. I made an effort to be understanding from the beginning, avoiding conflicts, understanding silences, accepting distances. Whenever something bothered me, I thought it was part of the natural adjustment of coexistence. Over the years, the routine took place. The responsibilities increased, the conversations decreased. I naturally took on the role of keeping everything running, as if that was my silent obligation. He organized the house, his life, his schedules, his emotions. And the more I did, the more invisible my effort became. I had children and gave myself completely to this role. My identity began to revolve around their needs. My desires were in the background, then in third, until they disappeared from the list. I told myself that that phase required sacrifice, that it was temporary, that one day there would be time left for me. At home, I learned to measure every word. He avoided sensitive subjects so as not to generate tension. He swallowed frustrations to preserve harmony. I believed that peace was the absence of confrontation, even if it meant the absence of truth. And so I transformed discomfort into silence, again and again. The curious thing is that the more correct my life seemed, the more distant I felt from myself. I accomplished tasks, solved problems, met expectations, but rarely asked myself if I was happy. My emotions were always postponed, treated as something secondary, something that could wait. There were times when the house was full, and yet I felt deeply alone. It wasn't physical loneliness, it was emotional. I was present, but I didn't feel seen. Even so, I justified it. I thought it was tiredness, a phase, an age thing. I never thought it could be emotional abandonment. Whenever a dissatisfaction arose with more force, I tried to neutralize it. She said that she needed to be grateful, that she had a good life, that she couldn't complain. I compared my reality with that of others and concluded that I had no right to discomfort. This logic kept me going, but it also kept me stuck. Over time, the body began to feel before the mind understood, a tiredness that did not go away, a constant tightness in the chest, a sadness for no clear reason. I kept going anyway, believing it was just the weight of adult life. I never thought it could be the accumulation of everything I shut up. This righteous life was built on small daily concessions. None seemed serious in isolation, but together they formed too heavy a load. I didn't see this clearly at the time. I just kept going, convinced that living was this: complying, enduring, continuing. Today I understand that that appearance of stability hid a profound absence of care for myself. I was so busy supporting everything and everyone that I forgot to support myself. And although this realization came late, it completely changed the way I started to look at my own history. I was always the one who understood. This phrase accompanied me for years without me realizing the weight it carried. I understood the other's tiredness, the bad mood, the prolonged silence, the repeated absences. I even understood what was never explained to me. I got ahead of myself, filled in gaps, created justifications even before someone needed to defend themselves. When something hurt me, my reaction was never immediate. I felt it, but soon I muffled it. I thought that maybe it wasn't the right time to talk, that maybe I was too sensitive that day, that maybe the other was going through something difficult. There was always a maybe that took me away from the simple truth. It had hurt. I believed that understanding was a way of loving, that the more I understood, the less conflict there would be. And in fact, there were almost no conflicts, at least not visible. Everything was resolved internally, by me, in long silent dialogues that no one else knew. I solved alone what should be shared. This attitude made people get used to it. They used to not explaining, not apologizing, not changing. After all, I always found a way to understand. There was always an acceptable reason, a reasonable excuse, a benevolent reading of the situation. And so, without realizing it, I taught others how they could treat me. There were times when I wondered if I was really so understanding or just afraid of being rejected. But he soon pushed that thought away. It was more comfortable to believe that I was mature, balanced, different. I was proud to be that person who didn't complicate, who didn't demand too much, who knew how to overlook. The problem is that understanding too much prevented me from being understood. My pains were not seen because they were rarely shown. My limits were not respected because they were almost never set. I became transparent, predictable, easy to ignore without guilt. In many conversations, I realized that my words were always careful, chosen not to bother. I spoke, but I didn't say everything. I explained, but I didn't confront it. And when something was unresolved, I myself closed the matter inside me, as if that were enough. As time went on, I began to feel a strange sense of imbalance. I knew a lot about others, their moods, their limits, their frailties, but I felt that no one really knew about me, not because they didn't want to, but because I never allowed them to know. Whenever I thought about changing this dynamic, I felt a deep fear. Fear of appearing harsh, selfish, ungrateful, fear of losing the little affection she believed she had. So I kept getting it, even when it meant disrespecting me. There were days when I felt emotionally exhausted, not knowing exactly why. It was as if I was always carrying something invisible, a weight that no one else saw. I understood others so much that there was no room left to understand myself. Today I realized that this attitude was not born of pure generosity, but of an old learning, that my role was to facilitate, to alleviate, to adapt. I was always the one who understood, because I never learned that someone could also understand me. And this realization, although painful, was the first step to start changing. The price of justifying everything did not appear all at once. He introduced himself little by little in a discreet, almost polite way. At first, it was just a mild tiredness, a feeling of always being one step behind myself. I didn't care. He said that it was normal, that everyone felt this way at some point in their lives. Over time, this fatigue took shape. I woke up already exhausted, even after a full night's sleep. It wasn't a physical fatigue, it was something deeper, difficult to explain. It was as if I was always on alert, always prepared to understand, to give in, to adapt to whatever came. There were days when I felt a tightness in my chest for no apparent reason. Nothing had happened, no argument, no harsh words. Still, the weight was there. I sat alone and tried to identify the source of that discomfort, but soon gave up. I explained to myself that it was anxiety, worry, an age thing. The more I justified, the less I could recognize my own limits. Everything seemed acceptable, as long as there was a reasonable explanation. I became too flexible, too understanding, too available, and this meant that my needs were always postponed, as if they were never urgent enough. On some nights, I found myself crying in silence, not knowing exactly why. It wasn't a desperate cry. It was contained, almost embarrassed. I wiped away tears quickly, as if I wasn't allowed to feel too much until then. The next day, he went on normally, as if nothing had happened. My body began to give clearer signals. Pain that came and went, a constant tension in my shoulders, a lump in my throat that appeared whenever I needed to say something important. Still, I avoided making calls. I preferred to believe that everything had a simple, fleeting cause, unrelated to what I felt. The hardest thing was to realize that I was always available to others, but rarely to myself. I listened, welcomed, advised. But when I tried to look inside, I felt lost. I no longer knew what I wanted, what I needed, what was good for me. I had spent so much time justifying it that I had forgotten to ask. There were times when I thought maybe I was exaggerating all of this, that maybe it was just oversensitivity, weakness, lack of gratitude. These ideas came quickly, well-trained, and made me retreat. It was easier to doubt myself than to question the pattern I had built myself. Justifying everything also had a price in my relationships. The more I accepted, the less I was noticed. My emotional absences were not noticed because I was always there physically. I fulfilled my role so well that no one imagined the internal cost of it. As the years passed, I began to feel that something in me was slowly fading away. Not dramatically, but steadily. I still smiled, talked, went on with life. But there was a part of me that was too tired to keep pretending that everything was fine. Today I understand that justifying everything kept me going, but it didn't keep me alive completely. The price was high. I lost intimacy with myself. I lost the clarity of my limits. I lost the lightness of existing without explaining myself all the time. And that cost, while silent, was the heaviest I've ever carried. There are phrases that do not age. They remain intact within us, even when everything around us changes. I don't remember exactly when I heard each one of them, but I do remember how they turned out. Some were said naturally, others in a tone of advice, others as a correction. They all found a place in me. You're exaggerating. This was one of the first. Whenever something affected me too much, it came up as a response. In the beginning, it came from abroad. Then, it started to come from within. All it took was for a nuisance to arise, and I myself repeated, almost automatically, that maybe it was nothing, that I was too sensitive. That's all in your head. This phrase taught me to distrust my own perceptions. If something seemed wrong, I would mentally review the situation until I found an alternative explanation. It was never the behavior of the other. It was almost always my interpretation that needed to be adjusted. You need to be stronger. I heard this so many times that I came to believe that feeling was a sign of weakness. Being strong, for me, has become synonymous with enduring silence. I didn't understand what strength can also be saying enough, asking for respect, recognizing limits. Everyone goes through this. This phrase made my pain seem small, ordinary, irrelevant. If everyone passed, then I also had to pass. There was no room to question, only to move forward, carrying whatever was necessary. It's not worth discussing. This was one of the most dangerous, because it taught me that silence was always the best option, that talking could make everything worse. So I kept quiet, even when something needed to be said, and what was not spoken piled up. You understand, right? I understood. I always understood. This phrase came almost as a confirmation of the role I already occupied, and each time I agreed, I reinforced the idea that my needs could wait. These phrases did not always come from the same person. They came from different places at different times. But they all had something in common. They distanced me from myself. They trained me to accept, justify, silence, and I absorbed each one without realizing it. Over time, these words ceased to be isolated memories and began to form an internal narrative, a voice that spoke to me in moments of doubt, a voice that convinced me to continue to endure, not to complicate, not to demand. There were times when I tried to question that voice, but it seemed too strong. It had been there for years, well established. It was easier to hear it than to face it. So I kept going, even when something in me was already too tired. Today, when I revisit these phrases, I can see them more clearly. They don't define who I am, but they explain much of what I've become. They were simple words, spoken without great intention, but which shaped choices, behaviors, and silences for a lifetime. Recognizing their weight was painful, but necessary, because as long as I believed in them, I kept justifying everything, and only when I started to question them, I also started to get closer to myself again. The day when someone didn't minimize what I felt started like any other. There was no expectation, no foreboding. I woke up with that well-known feeling of heaviness in my chest. I did my chores. I followed the routine. Nothing indicated that something different was about to happen, and perhaps that is why the impact was so profound. It was a simple, almost casual conversation. I mentioned something that had been bothering me for a long time, without details, without drama, in the careful way I always did. I expected the usual answer, a quick piece of advice, a relativization, a ready-made sentence that would close the subject. I was already prepared to agree and move on, but the answer did not come that way. The person looked at me attentively, without haste, without interruption. He didn't try to explain anyone's behavior. He didn't try to soften what I said. He just listened, and when he spoke, he said something I had never heard in that way. That must have been very difficult for you. That simple sentence ran through everything. I felt like someone had opened a window in a room that had been closed for decades. My body reacted before the mind. The lump in my throat appeared. My eyes filled with tears, and I had to take a deep breath to stay there, present at that moment. For the first time, I was not corrected, nor told to be stronger, nor reminded that it could be worse. No one told me that I was exaggerating or that I needed to let it go. What I felt was recognized as legitimate, without reservations, without conditions, and that left me completely disarmed. I realized at that moment how much I was used to defending myself even when I talked about myself, how much I was always ready to justify, to explain, to soften. And there, for the first time, I didn't have to do any of that. It was enough to exist and speak. This recognition brought with it an old pain, kept for a long time. It wasn't just about that specific situation. It was about all the others that were never validated. About all the times I kept quiet thinking that the problem was with me. All that came to light at once. I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Relief to finally be seen. Sadness to realize how long I spent without it. How many years did I spend believing that my emotions were inconvenient, exaggerated, unnecessary? How many times have I abandoned myself trying to be understanding? After that conversation, nothing changed externally immediately. The people around me remained the same. The routine continued. But something inside me had shifted. A question began to echo, insistent, impossible to ignore. What if it was never an exaggeration? I tried to push that question away in the following days, but it came back. In moments of silence before going to sleep, when waking up, it seeped into old memories, into situations that I had always explained too much. And little by little, he began to dismantle certainties that I had carried for a lifetime. That day was not a great event for the world, but for me, it was a silent break. It was the first time I seriously considered the possibility that I wasn't wrong for feeling. And this possibility, although frightening, opened a path of no return. I still didn't know what to do with this new consciousness. I only knew that something had been nominated for the first time. And when something is named, it can no longer be completely ignored. It was there that my awakening began, even though I still didn't have the courage to call it that. The question started small, almost shy, but it grew inside me until it occupied all the spaces. What if it was never an exaggeration? At first, I tried to push it away, as I did with so many other things throughout my life. He said that it was just an impression, that I was sensitive because of my age, that conversation had moved me too much. But the question wouldn't go away. She appeared in the quietest moments. When I washed the dishes alone, when I made the bed, when I looked at old photographs. Situations that always had a ready explanation began to present themselves in a different way. Old memories emerged with a different weight, as if they were finally allowed to exist. I started to revisit scenes from my life that I always told lightly. Interrupted conversations, decisions made without my opinion, prolonged silences that I accepted as normal. For the first time, I tried to look at all this without justifying myself. Just observe. And this simple change was disconcerting. I realized how much I have always been quick to protect others from emotional responsibility. I smoothed everything out, translated everything, explained everything. He did it so fast that there was barely time to feel anger, sadness, or indignation. Now, when I stopped running, these emotions began to appear. It was not easy to accept this new perspective. There was resistance. A part of me insisted that I was creating problems where none existed, that reliving the past was no use, that it was too late to question it. That voice was old, well-known, comfortable, but she could no longer completely silence the other. The other voice was calmer, but firmer. She said that feeling was not an exaggeration, that pain doesn't need to be compared to be valid, that the fact that I survived didn't mean that it had been fair. This voice didn't accuse anyone, it just invited me to be honest with myself. The more I allowed this honesty, the more I realized how much I was silenced in subtle ways. There were no major scenes, no evident aggressions. There were repeated small invalidations, looks that ended conversations, phrases that diminished what I felt. And I accepted all of this as normal. This realization brought sadness, but also clarity. I wasn't wrong for feeling bad so many times. I was not weak because I had suffered in silence. I just did what I learned to do to keep belonging. Recognizing this was painful, but also profoundly liberating. I began to notice how my body reacted when I didn't justify myself immediately. There was tension, fear, insecurity, but there was also a new, almost strange, sense of integrity, as if something inside me was finally aligned. I still didn't know what to make of all these discoveries. There was no plan, no drastic decisions. There was only this emerging certainty. I no longer needed to convince myself that everything was okay when it wasn't. And that was already a huge change. The question was still there, but now it no longer sounded threatening. What if it was never an exaggeration? For the first time, I seriously considered the answer. And in doing so, I began to see my story with more compassion for myself than I ever had. This is the hardest part to tell. Talking about it means giving up the silence that protected me for years and accepting the weight of being seen without explanations. If you have come this far with me, it is because you understand that some truths are too expensive to remain hidden. Sign up, not as a support for me, but as a gesture to preserve this voice and so many others that only exist because someone decides to listen. There came a time when I just got tired. It wasn't a sudden tiredness, one of those that knocked down at once. It was a slow, accumulated wear and tear that was installed until it became impossible to ignore. I was tired of explaining, justifying, translating feelings that no one seemed willing to fully understand. This fatigue was not only emotional, it was almost physical. I felt as if I carried an invisible weight on my shoulders, something that accompanied me all the time. Every conversation required preparation, every silence required interpretation, every attitude of others required an internal excuse. It was exhausting to always live in this state of alert. I realized that, even before anyone said anything, I was ready to defend, soften. My mind worked fast, creating narratives that spared the other and sacrificed me. And at that point in life, that mechanism began to fail. I no longer had the energy to sustain him. There were days when I just couldn't find convincing justifications anymore. Something happened. It hurt. And I stood there, not knowing what to say to myself. The old discourse no longer worked. And this void of explanations was scary at first, because I always knew what to think to continue. Without justifications, questions came. Why did I always need to figure it all out on my own? Why were my pains never urgent? Why did I try so hard to maintain relationships that didn't work for me? These questions did not come with easy answers, but they were too honest to ignore. I began to notice how much I explained myself, even in simple thoughts. If someone didn't care, I said I was busy. If someone moved away, I thought it was a phase. If someone treated me with indifference, I looked for external reasons. Realizing this was painful, because it showed how much I had normalized neglect. This tiredness also brought a kind of deep sadness. Not a dramatic sadness, but a constant melancholy, as if I were mourning something I never had. Perhaps it was the mourning for the version of me that deserved more care than it received, including from myself. At the same time, there was a strange relief in not being able to explain myself anymore. It was as if my body was saying enough before my mind had the courage to assume it. For the first time, I seriously considered the possibility of doing nothing, of not justifying, of not softening. This idea caused me fear of conflicts, of rejection, of ruptures. But the fear was no longer greater than the tiredness. I was too tired to continue being who I always was, too tired to sustain relationships with my understanding alone. I then began to be quieter in a different way. It was not the silence of those who swallow, but the silence of those who observe. I let things happen without immediately making sense of them. And that, while uncomfortable, began to show me truths I had never seen. I realized that many relationships only worked because I explained everything. Without this, emptiness, discomfort, distances would arise. And this observation was harsh, but enlightening. I wasn't the problem for feeling too much. I was just tired of abandoning myself so that everything would remain the same. This tiredness marked an internal limit that I had never set before. It was not a conscious decision, nor an elaborate plan. It was just the simple and definitive realization that I could no longer continue like this. And even though I didn't know what would come next, I knew something had to change. To stop justifying was not an announcement, nor a decision said out loud. It was something internal, almost imperceptible to outsiders, but profoundly transformative to me. I just stopped running to explain. I stopped organizing arguments, softening words, finding acceptable reasons for what hurt me. At first, this generated an eerie silence, a silence different from the one I have always practiced. Before, silence was laden with guilt and fear. Now, it was full of observation. I listened more, paid attention, felt the impact of attitudes without immediately canceling them with ready-made justifications. When something hurt, I let it hurt. He did not try to transform pain into immediate learning, nor into forced understanding. I just recognized it. That simple gesture was harder than I imagined, because it brought me face to face with emotions that I had always pushed away. There were situations in which people noticed the change. Comments that I would have explained before went unanswered. Attitudes that I used to overlook were exposed in the air without translation. Some people were confused, others were bothered. And for the first time, I didn't try to ease that discomfort. This new behavior awakened in me an old fear, that of seeming cold, distant, selfish. But along with the fear, there was something new growing, a sense of internal coherence. For the first time, what I felt and what I demonstrated were aligned. I realized how much I always did emotional work alone. I was the one who explained, who understood, who sowed the invisible tears of relationships. When I stopped doing that, a lot of these tears became apparent, and that was not my responsibility to solve. Some conversations have become shorter. Some silences were prolonged. I felt like going back to the old habit of fixing everything quickly, but something in me resisted. I needed to see what would happen if I didn't cancel myself out anymore. To stop justifying also meant accepting that not everything needed to be resolved immediately, that some things were simply what they were, that not all behavior deserved a careful explanation, that sometimes the clearest limit is conscious silence. In this process, I started to listen to myself more. I paid attention to the reactions of my body, the emotions that arose, the memories that came back. I was relearning to trust myself, something I had never really done. Not all relationships survived this change. Some have become distant, others have transformed. There were losses, and they hurt. But this time, the pain was accompanied by a strange sense of respect for myself. Stopping justifying did not solve everything, nor did it bring immediate peace. But it gave me back something essential, the feeling that I was, finally, on my own side. And that, after a lifetime of explaining it to me, was the beginning of a freedom that I didn't even know existed. I knew that not everyone would stay, but knowing it didn't prepare me to feel it. When I stopped justifying, something changed in the balance of relationships, and this was quickly evident. People who had always been there, used to my infinite understanding, began to walk away silently, almost embarrassed, as if they no longer knew what their place was with me. Some departures were subtle, fewer messages, fewer calls, less interest. Others were clearer, loaded with strangeness. I could tell in the looks and short answers that something was different, but no one spoke openly. For the first time, I didn't come forward to explain this silence. There were times when loneliness tightened strongly. I wondered if I had done the right thing, if I hadn't been too harsh, if I couldn't have acted more carefully. The old guilt tried to come back, whispering that I was demanding too much after so long accepting everything. What hurt was not only the loss, but the realization of the reason. Some relationships only existed because I supported everything alone. When I stopped carrying this weight, there was no longer enough structure to maintain proximity. This was difficult to accept, because it forced me to review the meaning of many bonds. There were also those who stayed. Few, but true. People who were not surprised by my new silence, who were not bothered by my firmer posture, who knew how to remain without demanding that I go back to who I was. These encounters gained a different, more real, more honest value. With those who stayed, I learned something new. I didn't have to explain myself all the time. I could speak less and still be understood. He could disagree without fear, set limits without guilt. This discovery was as surprising as it was liberating. Still, there were difficult nights. In the silence of the house, I felt the absence of those who left. It was not simple nostalgia, it was a mixture of grief and relief. I fight for what I believed those relationships were. Relief for no longer having to mold myself to keep them. I had to learn to live with the discomfort of not being everything to everyone, with the idea that some people preferred me in the old way, more available, more understanding, more silent. Accepting this was painful but also enlightening. I realized that many goodbyes were not explicit, but they were definitive. There were no fights, just distances that were consolidated. And for the first time, I didn't try to close that gap by force. I respected the movement even with a heavy heart. Over time, I began to feel something unexpected. Lightness. Fewer people around, but more space inside me. Less effort to please, less tension to keep up appearances. I was learning that presence is not measured by quantity, but by truth. Not all of them stayed, and that deeply marked this phase of my life. But those who stayed showed me that it was not wrong to change, that it was not too late to choose differently, and above all, that some losses are not failures. They are necessary consequences of finally respecting myself. Getting here was not easy. There were times when I thought it was too late to change anything, that my story was already written, and that the most I could do was accept it. But little by little, I came to understand that as long as there is awareness, there is still choice. And this perception changed everything. Today, at the age of 72, I look at my trajectory with different eyes. Not with anger, nor with a desire to correct the past, but with honesty. I see the woman I was, trying to survive the way she knew how, learning to adapt because she believed that this was the only possible path. For a long time, I thought the problem was me, that I felt too much, expected too much, needed too much. Now I know that what I lacked was not strength, it was permission. Permission to feel, to question, to say that something hurt without having to justify it. Understanding this has brought a different kind of peace. It is not a joyful or light peace all the time. It is a firm, silent peace that comes from the fact that I no longer betray myself. Even when it hurts, even when there are losses, I know I'm being true to myself. I learned that justifying what hurts is a way to prolong the pain, that over-explaining the behavior of others is often a way to avoid looking at one's own wound, and that real care doesn't require us to shrink to fit in. If I could talk to the woman I was in my 20s, in my 30s, in my 40s, I wouldn't tell her to be stronger. I would tell her to listen to herself. I would say that it is not selfish to respect yourself. That imposed silence was never a sign of love. I also learned that we don't need big confrontations to change a life. Sometimes it is enough to stop. Stop explaining, stop smoothing, stop carrying what was never ours. This silent interruption can be more transformative than any speech. Today, my life is simpler. I have fewer relationships, less noise, less effort. In return, I have more clarity, more presence, more truth. It is not a late reward. It is a conscious choice, made in the time that was possible. If anyone listening to this story recognizes themselves in me, I mean something important. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter how long you've been explaining yourself, adapting, being silent. It is always important to stop. It is always important to respect yourself. Some truths take a lifetime to accept, but even when they arrive late, they still liberate. If something that has been told here touched you, share this video. It's not just about an individual story, but about patterns of silence, guilt, and normalization that span many lifetimes. By sharing, you turn listening into action and can make this message reach exactly those who still need permission to recognize themselves and break their own silence. If something that has been told here touched you, share this video. It's not just about an individual story, but about patterns of silence, guilt, and normalization that span many lifetimes. By sharing, you turn listening into action and can make this message reach exactly those who still need permission to recognize themselves and break their own silence.